In February of 1258, an army surrounded the richest city on earth. Baghdad had stood for 500 years. It held the largest library in the world, the greatest hospital in the world, and the accumulated mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy of every civilization the Islamic world had ever touched. Greek, Persian, Indian, Chinese, translated, corrected, expanded, and stored in one place. 13 days later, the city was on fire, the library was in the river, and the man who had ruled it was dead, rolled inside a carpet and trampled by horses, because his killers were superstitious about spilling royal blood on the ground. The chroniclers wrote that the Tigris ran black for days, not with blood, with ink. This is what actually happened, why the most powerful city in the world was almost defenseless, and how much of that famous story is true. To understand the scale of the loss, you have to understand what Baghdad was. And it was not just a capital. It was founded in 762 by the Abbasid caliph al-Mansur as a perfect circle. A round city with the palace and mosque at the center and 4 gates pointing outward to the corners of the empire. Within 80 years, it was probably the largest city on the planet. And it was built around an idea that almost no other empire in history had committed to at that scale. That knowledge, wherever it came from, belonged to everyone who could use it. The Abbasids ran what later historians would call the translation movement. They paid enormous sums to acquire Greek manuscripts from Byzantium, Sanskrit texts from India, Persian works from the old Sasanian archives. Then they had them translated into Arabic, checked against each other, and corrected. That is not a small thing. Most of what Europe would eventually recover of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Euclid came back to Europe through Arabic. The Greek originals were gone. The Baghdad copies were what survived. And Baghdad did not just preserve. Al-Khwarizmi, working in this tradition, gave us the word algorithm. It is his name. And the word algebra, from the title of his book. Ibn al-Haytham essentially invented the experimental method in optics. Al-Razi wrote clinical medicine that European doctors were still using 500 years later. By 1258, the Golden Age was already past its peak. The caliph no longer ruled an empire, he ruled a city and its hinterland, with religious authority stretched thin across a fractured Islamic world. But the books were still there, the scholars were still there, the institutions were still there. And then a man on the other side of Asia decided the caliph should kneel. His name was Hulagu Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis and a brother of 2 other men you have heard of, Mungke, the great Khan, and Kublai, who would go on to rule China. In 1251, Mungke gave Hulagu a mandate for the West. The instruction, as it comes down to us, was blunt. Bring the Islamic world under Mongol authority. If they submit, treat them well. If they resist, destroy them. Hulagu did not rush. It took him years just to move his army west, an enormous logistical operation involving bridges, road repair, and grazing land negotiated in advance across thousands of miles. Chinese siege engineers came with him, along with their trebuchets and their gunpowder devices. His first target was not Baghdad. It was the Nizari Ismailis, the sect Europeans called the Assassins, who had held a network of mountain fortresses in northern Persia for 150 years and had never been dislodged by anyone. In 1256, Hulagu took Alamut, their central stronghold. The order that had terrified every ruler in the region for 6 generations was finished in about a year. That should have been the warning. The 37th Abbasid caliph was named al-Mustasim. He had inherited the most prestigious title in Sunni Islam and very little of the power that used to come with it. Hulagu sent envoys. The terms were the standard Mongol offer. Submit, tear down your defenses, pay tribute, and you keep your throne as a vassal. Al-Mustasim refused. His reasoning, as far as we can reconstruct it, was theological as much as political. He was the commander of the faithful. If Baghdad were truly threatened, he believed, the entire Muslim world would rise to defend it, from Syria, from Egypt, from everywhere. He appears to have told the envoys something to the effect that the Mongols could not take the city, and that if they tried, the earth itself would turn against them. Nobody came. Egypt was under the Mamluks, who had their own problems. Syria was fragmented. The regional powers who might have marched had spent the previous century fighting each other and, in some cases, fighting Baghdad. The caliph's spiritual authority was real, but by 1258 it did not translate into armies. There is also a long-standing accusation, repeated in a lot of popular history, that the caliph's vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, deliberately ran down the city's defenses and secretly corresponded with the Mongols. It's worth being careful here. That story appears most forcefully in sources written after the fact by authors hostile to him, and modern historians treat it as, at best, unproven. What is clear is that Baghdad's garrison was badly undermanned, badly paid, and badly led, and that the caliph did essentially nothing to change that in the 2 years he had to prepare. Hulagu's army reached Baghdad in January 1258. Estimates vary wildly, but it was almost certainly the largest force the Mongols ever put in the field in the west. Well over 100,000 men, including Armenian, Georgian, Persian, and Turkic contingents. They arrived on both banks of the Tigris and closed the ring. The siege proper began on January 29th. The Chinese engineers went to work on the eastern wall. On February 5th, the Mongols took a section of it. The caliph, realizing at that point that no relief force existed, tried to negotiate. Hulagu was no longer interested in negotiating. On February 10th, the city surrendered. On February 13th, the Mongol army entered. What followed lasted roughly a week. The death toll is genuinely disputed. Hulagu himself, in a letter to the King of France, claimed 200,000. Later chroniclers, some writing a century after, put it as high as 800,000, or 1 million, or 2 million. The city's total population was probably somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000, which makes the highest figures impossible on their face. Most modern estimates land in the range of tens of thousands to a couple 100,000. That is still one of the worst massacres of the pre-modern world. And then there is the library. The famous line is that the Mongols threw so many books into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink for days, and that a horse could cross the river on the bridge of manuscripts. Here is the honest version. That image comes from later chroniclers, not from eyewitnesses, and it is very likely rhetorical rather than literal. But the underlying loss is not in doubt. The libraries of Baghdad were destroyed or dispersed. The scholarly institutions were gutted. The men who could read and copy and teach those texts were killed or scattered. Whatever the river did or didn't look like, what disappeared in that week was the working center of a 500-year intellectual tradition. And unlike a building, that is not something you rebuild by hiring masons. Al-Mustasim was kept alive for about 10 days after the city fell. The story that has come down to us, reported by Marco Polo, among others, with variations, is that Hulagu had the caliph locked in his own treasury and told him to eat his gold, since he had valued it enough to hoard it instead of paying for soldiers. That detail may be embellishment. What is consistently reported across sources is the manner of his death, around February 20th, 1258. The Mongols had a taboo about spilling royal blood on the earth. So the last Abbasid caliph of Baghdad was rolled up inside a carpet, and the Mongol cavalry rode over him until he was dead. His sons were killed with him. The line that had held the caliphate since 750 ended in a courtyard. The part that gets left out of most tellings is what happened to the land. Mesopotamia was farmland only because of an irrigation network that had been maintained continuously for thousands of years. Canals, dikes, sluices, all of it requiring constant labor. The Mongols wrecked large sections of it, and the population that maintained it was gone. Agriculture in central Iraq collapsed, and in some regions did not recover for centuries. That did more long-term damage than any single week of burning. 2 years later, in 1260, a Mongol army under one of Hulagu's generals met the Egyptian Mamluks at a place in Galilee called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The Mamluks won. It was the first time a Mongol field army had been decisively beaten and stayed beaten, and it marked the practical limit of Mongol expansion west. Hulagu himself was not there. He had withdrawn most of his forces east after Munka died, to be near the succession fight. The caliphate technically survived. A surviving Abbasid relative was installed in Cairo under Mamluk protection, where the title lasted another 2.5 centuries as a purely ceremonial office with no power at all. And here is the strangest footnote in the whole story. Traveling with Hulagu's army was a Persian scholar named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the finest mathematicians and astronomers of the age. He had been with the Ismailis at Alamut, and he switched to the Mongols when they took it. He was present for the fall of Baghdad, and he used his position to salvage instruments, manuscripts, and scholars out of the wreckage. 3 years later, Hulagu funded him to build an observatory at Marageh in northern Iran, with a library reportedly stocked with tens of thousands of volumes pulled out of Baghdad and elsewhere. The astronomical models al-Tusi developed there, particularly the geometric device now called the Tusi couple, appear almost verbatim in the work of Copernicus 300 years later. Historians still argue about exactly how they got there. So the same campaign that destroyed the greatest center of learning in the world also, incidentally, funded the institution that carried a piece of it forward. And that piece ended up underneath the model of the solar system we still use. History rarely gives you a clean lesson. Mostly it gives you this: the thing everyone assumes is permanent isn't. Baghdad had been the center of the world for 5 centuries. It took 13 days. If you made it this far, subscribe. New history every week.